Magic the Gathering has had dozens of expansions and side sets that have added to and changed the game. From powerful new cards that define formats to new mechanics that explore new design territory, there are plenty of ways a set can have an impact. That impact isn't always positive, however, as Magic has had several sets that were missing or outright negatives to the game. Some sets are so bad that they offer little to nothing substantial, or the substantial things they do offer are seen as negatives for their overall impact on the game. Starting off at number 10, we have Unhinged. This set was released in 2004 and was the second comedy-themed expansion Magic had done. While the cards in Unhinged were not legal for tournament play, Unhinged was designed around being played and drafted like most any other Magic set. These unsets are often home to strange or silly designs that do not work conventionally within the rules or are too silly for a typical game of Magic. The intent of these unsets was to create novel and fun games of Magic that would otherwise not exist. Unhinged does have some amusing cards, however, the general design philosophy of Unhinged goes against what makes an unset entirely. Many of the mechanics in Unhinged were actively unfun and warp the format around it. The most notorious example was the gotcha mechanic. Gotcha spells have the bonus effect of returning themselves from the graveyard whenever you catch your opponent doing a specific action. Spell counter can counter target spell, and whenever an opponent says the word spell or counter, you may say gotcha, then return spell counter to your hand. These gotcha spells effectively policed how players acted during the game, with many of them able to get value off of very minor things like touching your face. Instead of focusing on the silly cards or gag mechanics, you instead had to make sure you were following proper etiquette as to not give your opponent a free piece of interaction. Gotcha spells appeared at low rarity to the point where basically every draft match was going to have at least one gotcha card imposing itself on the table. But that was far from the only unfun mechanic in Unhinged. This set also introduced fractional power and toughness, leading to cards like Little Girl that cost half a white mana and had 1/2 power and 1/2 toughness. While amusing at a glance, these fractional stat lines made combat a nightmare to track, and life totals annoying to manage. Other cards forced physical actions from players, some of which not every player would be able to properly do. Standing Army is a card that at best will be annoying to someone forced to stand for the most of their match, and at worst doesn't even work because the person using it physically cannot stay standing. Unhinged went down as a set with some novel ideas, but generally unfun to actually play. And while every Magic set aims to be fun, it's an especially notable miss when the gag set fails to charm. Considering that gag sets are far and few between and not tournament legal, it's only worth the 10th spot of this list. But the fact that Unhinged came across so poorly is in part why it took so many more years to see another unset. For number 9, we have March of the Machine, The Aftermath. The Aftermath was a micro set which followed up 2023's standard set March of the Machine. While in the past Magic has done multiple sets continuing one storyline, this was the first time Magic produced an epilogue set. Instead of a full-size set, March of the Machine, The Aftermath consisted of just 50 mechanically unique cards. These epilogue boosters came with 5 cards, many of which were bulk commons and uncommons with little to no constructive application. The potential pulls in this set were increased by giving every single card in the set an alternate treatment. This means that Aftermath simultaneously has only 50 cards in it, yet has almost 180 unique card treatments one can potentially pull. The set's primary aim was to tie together the storyline of the Phyrexian invasion arc, yet dedicate only 50 card slots to try and summarize the aftermath of the invasion. It didn't help that many of the cards in the set lacked any direct ties to the Phyrexian plotline, and seemingly were introduced for no real narrative reason. And even the cards that did reference the plotline often had little to say, such as Markov's Baron's only connection being the chair he sits on is made of Phyrexian metal. The real significant cards in the set came in the form of the former Planeswalker who lost their sparks and the Spark Rupture. These are the one saving grace of the set, providing legendary creature versions of some of the game's most popular characters. One of these desparked Planeswalkers was Nissa Resurgent Animist, whose landfall ability synergized with the 4-color elemental decks in the modern format. She remains the only real chase card in the set, with the only other cards of any value being alternate treatments of some of the legendary creatures in the set. Epilogue boosters were not received kindly by the fanbase, especially considering the price point for these packs was not too far from a standard set booster pack. It was basically the same price for less cards, not even mentioning the fact that most of these cards were unplayable. While not a full-size set like some of the others on this list, Aftermath is certainly one of the most lackluster releases in recent history. And at number 8, we have Chronicles. This set, released in 1995, is not technically an official expansion, and instead the first ever Magic reprint set. In terms of card inclusion, Chronicles is arguably the best set on this list. Notable cards like Ashnod's Altar from the prior year were reprinted in one set with a white border. This border was intended to differentiate these reprints from the original printings of the cards, and as such, preserve the original card's value. However, Chronicles was printed quite excessively, in part out of hopes to make the cards more accessible. While this did work, it also tanked the value of several cards in the earliest days of Magic's secondary market. Rares such as Killer Bees were reprinted as an uncommon, and the sheer density of these uncommons printed in the market made the originals far cheaper. A vocal portion of the Magic community felt that this level of reprints harmed the collectible value and safety of the game. This response was notable enough to Wizards that they wound up making an agreement to never reprint any of the as of yet unreprinted rares from 1994. These cards ineligible for reprints are known as the reserve list and are still unable to be reprinted to this day. Most players these days actively do not want the reserve list around anymore. This is in part because many of the cards in the reserve list, such as the original dual lands, are staples in certain formats, and as such are incredibly expensive. Chronicles injected so many cards into the market so early into the game's lifespan that it spawned one of the most restrictive policies Wizards has created. While Chronicles, in a vacuum, succeeded making the cards within it more accessible, on the grand scale, the legacy of Chronicles is one of inaccessibility. The reserve list has been skirted around in the past, but is unlikely to ever be outright removed. Some could argue that Chronicles itself isn't a bad set, and from a design angle, it's not. But the way it was distributed and how the backlash to it was handled culminated in one of the worst decisions in Magic's history. And at number 7, we have Born of the Gods. This set released in 2014 and was the second set in the Theros block. A block was a group of sets, usually on the same plane, meant to be played together with some mechanical overlap. Theros was the first big set of the block, which was then followed by Born of the Gods and Journey into the Nyx. The preceding set to Born of the Gods introduced mechanics such as Devotion and a reprint of one of the most widely played black spells ever, Thoughtseize. Born of the Gods, on the other hand, was extremely underwhelming. Tribute creatures in Born of the Gods offered your opponent a choice when they entered the battlefield, such as Nessie and Demolock either entering with 3+1/+1 counters or destroying a non-creature permanent when it enters the battlefield. Given that your opponent chooses which mode, tribute creatures essentially will only ever enter the battlefield as whatever version is worse in the current situation. If your opponent has a board full of strong creatures, they'd simply give your tribute creature the counters and run over it. Beyond underwhelming mechanics, most of the actual cards in the set had little to no impact upon release. Brimaz, King of Oreskos, was the most playable card from the set for a vast majority of the set's lifespan, with other notable inclusions such as the mythic rare gods only really finding proper homes in the casual format of Commander for the most part. The uncommon removal spell Bile Blight saw more play in Standard than any of the Born from the Gods mythics combined. Cards in the set are so underpowered that they even generally lacked impact in Theros Limited. At the time of Born of the Gods release, the standard ratio for drafts was 2 packs of Theros and 1 Born of the God packs. Unless you pulled something like Brimaz or one of the more playable low rarity options from the set like Fall of the Hammer, then the Born of the Gods pack would do little to shake up or change your draft. The biggest saving grace for Born of the Gods is that over time more cards in the set have found their home. Xenagos, God of Revels, has found a niche in a Pioneer due to being one of the most compact win conditions available in Indomitable Creativity, able to boost a creature to well over lethal combat damage after it's cheated out into play. Even with this in mind, however, it's just one more playable card in a set that otherwise is underwhelming. That said, the set does have more playable cards than the typical bad set, which is part of why it only lands at 7th on this list. And at number 6, we have Dragon's Maze. Released in 2013, Dragon's Maze was the third set in the Return to Ravnica block. The most glaring issue with Dragon's Maze was how entirely underwhelming it was. Return to Ravnica, the first set in the block, introduced powerful cards like Deathrite Shaman, which forever shifted how the game was played. While Return to Ravnica and Gatecrash built up this overarching mystery of the Dragon's Maze and what completing it might unlock, the payoff in Dragon's Maze left a lot to be desired. Not only was a narrative an underwhelming race across the plane to decide the new guild pack, the disappointment boiled over into the set itself. The Maze's End was an alternate win condition card that would not see any play until a subsequent Ravnica set, leaving the most important idea of the block with a card players would rarely use. Despite the set's name, this set also contained no dragons of any kind. This is in part because Niv Mizzet, the dragon who created the maze, appeared in the previous set and thus could not appear in this one. Many players who had expected to see a full set of dragons instead found themselves looking at cards with no relation to the current type. Cards in this set were generally so undesirable that the token for Voice of Resurgence you could pull in the packs was worth more than most of the rares and mythics of the set for several years. The most desirable cards in the pack of Dragon's Maze aren't even from Dragon Maze, since the packs have a roughly 1 in 12 chance of including a Shockland from one of the previous 2 Ravnica sets. While far from the worst set, Dragon's Maze was a sour ending to a generally well-received revisit to the plane, which muddled both narrative and gameplay ideas, and it had basically no cards with even standard construction potential. For number 5, we have Fallen Empires. Released in 1994, Fallen Empires was the 5th expansion released in Magic. Given it was one of the earliest Magic sets, it was not designed for limited play and essentially only existed to add more cards to the card pool. The set, to its credit, did have a few powerful cards, such as Hymn to Torok, which is one of the best discard spells ever printed. The other most notable card in the set was High Tide, which could be used to generate tons of mana and even combo off. Both of these cards were common, however, and thus weren't hard to pull. And with most every other high card in the set being underwhelming beyond some creatures, like Ishin's Shade, there wasn't much demand for the set, especially as more powerful creatures came out in subsequent releases. This was also the first set Wizards printed with a wider print run, and attempting to correct the scarcity of the earlier sets that overshot the mark and instead flooded stores with Fallen Empires product. While a dud set is nothing new by current standards, this was the first proper flop in Magic's history. To this day, sealed product of Fallen Empires is significantly cheaper than other sets from the time. A pack of Fallen Empires sells for roughly $15 at the time of recording, as compared to the previous set, The Dark, having packs worth over $100. As the first truly unwanted Magic set with fewer notable cards in the modern day than it did when it was released, it's easy to write Fallen Empires off entirely. Yet it did make the notable design choice to include multiple artworks for the same card in the set. Order the Ebon Hand and other commons in the set had various artworks that could each appear in your pack to increase variety and make the cards more exciting to players. At the time, this was deemed as a mistake and scrapped for future sets since it was deemed as confusing to new players. However, these days, Magic the Gathering sets have just as many if not more alternate artworks and treatments than Fallen Empires did. So while Fallen Empires is certainly one of Magic's most lackluster sets, it also has had some ripples on modern Magic for better or for worse. And at number 4, we have Battle for Zendikar. This set from 2015 was the first set in what was the first 2-set block. This in of itself wouldn't have been a problem, however it was not a 2-set block from the onset and was initially designed as a 3-set block. The change in structure required a complete rework of the block. Themes were shifted around and truncated and helped aid some of the more glaring issues with the set. One of the biggest rifts first and foremost was with the approach to the Eldrazi, the Eldritch exoplanar beings at the center of the set's conflict. Instead of focusing on specific synergies with the Eldrazi creature type like in the previous Zendikar block, they aimed to focus on colorless synergies instead. As such, Devoid was created, a keyword that indicates that the card has no color regardless of its mana cost. The Eldrazi themselves were no longer the massive behemoths with game warping abilities they once were on average, even at lower rarity. Instead, they had mechanics like ingest on smaller, less imposing bodies that muddled the identity of Eldrazi. Some of these smaller Eldrazi in the follow-up set wound up working with some of the older Eldrazi support to be so powerful, it would end up breaking the modern format. That follow-up set, Oath of the Gatewatch, introduced the colorless mana symbol, retroactively making it so cards like Sol Ring tap for colorless mana instead of generic mana. It even introduced Waste as colorless basic lands. The introduction of Waste was meant to be a twist of sorts, yet in the process, this muddled things for players when looking at the block. Eldrazi Scion tokens appeared in both sets, yet had entirely different formatting in their ability. Considering the sets were meant to be drafted together, it simply added confusion when similar or even identical cards or tokens in the pack were worded differently. Even beyond this confusing element, the actual cards in Battle for Zendikar were generally lackluster. Green was so underpowered in the set that it struggled even in draft, let alone with constructed application. The set did have some constructed powerhouses in the form of Gideon, ally of Zendikar, and the Eldrazi Titan, but beyond those mythic bombs, the set was vastly underpowered. Allies were supposed to benefit from other allies, yet many allies had standalone abilities or no abilities at all. There was no real cohesion to building an ally deck, and the constructed playable ally cards could have not had the ally typing at all and would have changed nothing. It doesn't help that those few playable allies like Sylvan Advocate came from Oath of the Gatewatch. Battle for Zendikar was a near complete mechanical miss that needed its follow-up set to have basically any cohesion to its themes. While the card quality is higher than some of the other sets on this list, Battle for Zendikar came out at a time where Wizards should have known better, having learned from blocks like Kamigawa. As a more recent set that failed so miserably beyond a few hit cards, Battle for Zendikar earns its spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Prophecy. Released in 2002, it was the final set of the Masks block. This block as a whole was designed in response to the overpowered Urza's block. The cards in the Urza's block were so overpowered that it actively threatened the health of the game. Mercadian Masks was purposefully a giant step back in power. And while the other two sets in the block were already weak, Prophecy is much weaker. Rares such as Blessed Wind had effects that were not only underwhelming, but for much higher mana values than what would have seen in the prior blocks. Middling creatures like Glittering Lion were printed with notable downsides that allowed your opponent to pay mana to prevent your effect. It's one of these taxing cards that would wind up being the most notable card for Prophecy in the form of Rhystic Study. Whenever your opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless they pay 1 mana to prevent this effect. The card found its home in the Commander format, where 3 opponents each trying to cast their spells would mean you'd often draw multiple cards with Rhystic Studies before your next turn. Overall, Prophecy is underwhelming with very few cards that have any relevance in the modern day. While certainly one of the worst sets in Magic, it's saved from landing any higher in this list by being deliberately low power. Prophecy was designed to be a safer set than the block that came before it out of fear of making another block full of cards that needed to be banned. While this means it's still one of the worst sets ever made, it's not quite as bad as some of the others that were made under far less tight constraints. And at number 2, we have Saviors of Kamigawa. Released in 2005, Kamigawa was the 3rd set in the Kamigawa block. The Kamigawa block as a whole is remembered somewhat unfavorably for low-powered or parasitic mechanics. Abilities like Arcane were interesting in theory, yet not only required a high density to work in draft, but also would not see further expansion after Kamigawa. While any of these 3 sets could arguably be included on this list, Saviors of Kamigawa is arguably the worst. Of the new keyword mechanics introduced in the set, only Channel has seen any further development or support in future sets. The other 2 mechanics from the set, Sweep and Epic, both essentially made it harder to play the game. Sweep returns multiple lands from the field to your hand to get an effect, whereas Epic locks you into only ever casting that one Epic spell for the rest of the game. These effects, beyond just being outright bad, often made games slower and more swingy with cards that took away your other options for more marginal upsides. As if that wasn't enough, the individual cards in the set were fairly lackluster as well. The only card from the set that has ever seen proper competitive longevity is Pithy Needle, with other notable cards having come and gone in terms of their playability. Ebony Owl Netsuke used to be a key card in the Owling Mine deck, but it's a deck that has not seen any real relevance for years. Even though the other Kamigawa sets in the block were bad, they also had a higher density of notable and powerful cards. Umezawa's Jite is a card so powerful it still sees play in Legacy to this very day. And while Pithy Needle is a sideboard card worth considering, it's one that has seen multiple cards attempt to replace it. Saviors of Kamigawa is mainly remembered for being the most underwhelming set in a block of an underwhelming set, with very little to remember it for beyond mechanics we'll likely never see again. And finally, for number 1, we have Homelands. Released in 1995, Homelands was the 7th set released in Magic's history. While pretty much every Magic set in one way or another was designed by the actual development team, Homelands is unique in that it was a set helmed by Wizards of the Coast creative leads. The designers who had worked on the first 6 sets were able to make small suggestions and tweaks, but generally could not make sweeping changes to the set. This led to Homelands being a set full of very flavorful, narrative-rich cards that had little to no gameplay use. One effect of this was that many cards had effects that didn't really match their color identities, especially at the time, such as the heavy number of green creatures with flying, a keyword most commonly found on white and blue creatures. There were also cards such as Didgeridoo, which had extremely narrow specific effects with narrative significance, but little gameplay impact. In the case of Didgeridoo, it would take until Theros block over a decade later to see more Minotaurs, and the card is still not playable to this day, nearly 2 decades later. Cards in Homelands were so underwhelming and so unwanted that for a short period of time, Wizards made it so tournament decks had to have a certain number of cards from each expansion in their deck. This led to widespread adoption of serrated arrows in standard decks, as it was the best, most generic card in the set. To this day, there are still a few cards of note from the set, such as Merchant Scroll, which is a playable tutor spell even now. But despite these few cards of note, there is not a single card in Homelands worth more than a pack of Homelands. And Homelands packs go for roughly $12 at the time of recording. Homelands is an infamous instance of an experimentation for Magic. Many of Magic designers actively did not want the set to ship as it was so clearly underwhelming at launch, but the higher-ups did not want to go back on their promise to let the creative team handle a set. As such, Homelands will always be remembered as one of the absolute worst set in Magic's history, if a rather flavorful one. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other sets you feel were worth an inclusion? Any other topics you'd like to see discussed? If so, let us know down in the comments below.